have to introduce yourself. I'm Tom McMillan. I used to work for the Penguins. I'm retired now. I do what I really love, which was history. But I wanted to start tonight by letting you know something about your society. I grew up in Bellevue and spent most of my early life in the North Hills. My parents knew nothing about family ancestry, so I didn't either. In about 2013, I decided that they were gone. I decided to start looking into it. And I found that I had a great-grandfather named William Webster Murray, who used to be the county commissioner and who lived in Bridgeville. And so I wrote to the Bridgeville Historical Society, cold, they didn't know who I was, and they were very nice. They got back to me and they sent me a book. They sent me this little Bridgeville book, which you all know. And on page 30 is a picture of my great-grandfather's house, and the only picture I've ever seen of my great-grandmother. So you never know. When I was just telling John, who wrote the book, you know, all those pictures of old people in there, you don't know, they don't mean anything, but one photo means a lot to one person. And that photo meant a lot to me, because again, it's my only connection to my great-grandparents. So I really appreciate the Historical Society helping me out with that. So to this project, The Year That Made America, when I told my friends I was writing a book about the Declaration of Independence, most of the reaction was, where did that come from? Because they knew that I was a history geek, but most of that was Gettysburg and the Civil War. And my answer was, it was kind of a lifelong journey that I didn't realize I was on. We always learn about this stuff in school. 4th of July, Declaration of Independence. 4th of July, all men are created equal. 4th of July, 4th of July, 4th of July. We never look too deeply into how or why it happened. And almost embarrassed to say, my first indication that it was something more than just a nice, neat little 4th of July legend came in the 1970s era musical comedy 1776, which is very loosely based on some of the things that might have happened. It's not very good history. It's mostly entertainment. Hasn't aged well. They show it every year on the 4th. But there's one scene that people from my generation, our generation, if they remember it, will remember this one. It was the Continental Congressmen are standing up and chanting at John Adams, "Sit down, John, for God's sake, John, sit down." And we know that didn't happen, but they probably thought of it. He could be quite cantankerous when he was talking about this stuff. Then fast forward to the early 2000s, the HBO miniseries John Adams, based on the book by the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David McCullough of Pittsburgh, so you know it's based on a good foundation of history. There's 7 episodes. The second one is titled Independence, and they spend about 30 minutes on the debate for independence. And believe it or not, with all the documentaries out there, there's not a good documentary on how the Declaration happened. The Adams miniseries is about the best on-screen depiction. And there's a really good scene. It comes right after the Continental Congressmen have voted for independence. And the Secretary of Congress is reading the results, and he says, 12 votes for, none against, 1 abstention, the resolution passes. And then there's about 30 seconds of silence, which is a long time in television. They're panning the faces of the congressmen, and the looks in their faces are, oh my God, what have we done? Just think of it. It was very exciting, also terrifying. If this thing doesn't work out, these guys are hanging for treason. Really powerful scene, made me think a lot. Still not writing a book. Fast forward to 2021, January. I'm working from home, as a lot of us were back then. So I was able to watch the events of January 6th unfold in real time, and we're not going to go too much into that for obvious reasons, but one of the side angles of that day that stuck to me was the 1776 imagery. There were people waving 1776 flags. There were people chanting 1776. There were Congress members tweeting, "This is our 1776 moment." And it got me to thinking, these people really know what happened in 1776? So that's what got me, that is what got me started reading. And I reread McCullough's book, and the National Archives is an incredible resource online. Letters and documents, and was digging through them. And I quickly came to realize that not only did they not know what happened, I didn't know what happened. So this book really is my own personal journey to find out all these things that happened that I didn't know about in this really important time in American history. And hopefully I take the reader along with me on that journey. Now, the thing I knew, the biggest challenge I knew I'd have from the start was our national obsession with one date, the 4th of July. as though everything happened on that day, which it most assuredly did not. So there's a reason that the book does not have a chapter titled 4th of July. It does have chapters titled the 9th of January, the 15th of May, the 7th of June, the 28th of June, the 2nd of July, the 9th of July, the 2nd of August, and the 25th of December. And had I wanted to carry it into, I could have gone to the 17th of January if I wanted to carry it into 1777, but I wanted to keep those dates in 1776. The point being, there were many dates, many crucial dates on the road to independence. And if the events of those dates had not happened, we would be telling a somewhat different story today. So when you're writing a book, this is my 5th, you have to figure out some things before you get down to writing. One of my questions was, what was the original copy of the official copy of the Declaration of Independence commissioned by the Continental Congress? Which one was official? Because if you Google that phrase, you come up with several different versions. The words are all the same, but the presentations are different. So here are 3 candidates that could be the official version. Would you click the first one? That looks pretty official. In Congress, a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America. At the bottom, the typeset names of John Hancock, the president, Charles Thompson, the secretary, certainly a candidate. Next one. That's the one that's most familiar to us, the handwritten version that's signed. If you look at the top, there's a different updated title. This is the unanimous declaration. So wait, wasn't this the original? I thought this was the original. Was there one before this? It's candidate. Next one. There we go. Or is this the official version? Again, it has unanimous, nice and neat typesetting in. Nice and neat, unanimous in the headline. But you'll see this is the first time that the Congress, the signers are identified by state. You see who from New Hampshire, who from Connecticut, who from Georgia signed this thing. The answer, folks, is all 3 are official. They were all commissioned by the Continental Congress between July 1776 and January 1777. We'll talk in a bit why we needed so many official versions. And then I had to come up with the answer to this burning question. Who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Say that to the same group of friends, and they would say, wait, you're writing a book of the Declaration, you don't know who wrote it? Everyone knows that. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. He wrote the original draft. He wrote most of it. But we have Jefferson's original draft, and there were 86 editorial changes made to that draft. 47 were made by a 5-man committee that Jefferson was part of with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And 39 were made by the entire Congress. Congress did some real surgery. They cut out about a quarter of it. They completely eliminated Jefferson's passage blaming black slavery on the King of England, King George III. They thought that was ridiculous. And they also significantly rewrote the last paragraph, which to them was the most important paragraph. That's where they declared independence. We focus now on that beautiful second paragraph, self-evident truth. They blew right by that. Because the writing style back then in the 18th century was you built to a crescendo and you made your point at the end. So there were certain words and phrases they wanted in there. And that is the reason, folks, there are some passages, small passages of the Declaration of Independence that are carved on the wall of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. that were not written by Thomas Jefferson. How did that happen? The committee in the 1940s, they're going to put the memorial together. The Declaration has 1,300 words. They can't all be there. So the committee decided these are the words we wanted. But the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he wanted to crack at it. He wanted the final say. He was a big historian, big fan of Jefferson, as many presidents were. And he knew that that final paragraph was really important to those 1776 guys. So he inserted a couple of those phrases, not knowing that Jefferson didn't write some. So that's how they got it. Does it matter? No. Everything's edited. My book is edited. It just goes to show you that history can sometimes play a few tricks on us. That's a good answer to a trivia question, too, if you're talking with friends about history. So, when did the American Revolution begin? Historians have never been able to settle on one date. You can take it back to the 1760s, Stamp Act protest, the Stamp Act Congress, taxation without representation, that's where that came from. 1770, Boston Massacre, 1773, Boston Tea Party, 1775, Lexington and Concord. So many important steps on the way. But I wanted to focus on the first 7 or 8 months of 1776 and the political struggle for the Declaration of Independence. And that's why I came up with the dates that I decided to use. So my first date is January 9th, the 9th of January. Doesn't sound like a very big holiday, does it? We wouldn't be celebrating. But a couple of key things happened on that day. Late 1775, the colonists came to realize that King George III was really upset with them. They had been agitating for about 2 years to restore their rights within the British Empire. This did not begin as a quest for independence. But now shots have been fired, the king's upset, he gives a speech in late 1775 where he says, "You say you want to have your rights restored, but I see through that. I think you want to break away. You want to be independent. You are rebels." He threatens military action, says this will be decided by blows. And the Loyalist faction in the Continental Congress, which was still pretty large back then, was mortified. On January 9th, one of them proposed a resolution whereby Congress would disavow any interest in independence. Samuel Adams and some of the radicals stepped forward, they blocked it, delayed it, it went away. But I think it's important to note that as late as January of 1776, there were congressmen willing to vote to disavow independence. That same day, January 9th, or January 10th, it's disputed a bit in history, is when Thomas Paine came up with his famous book, Common Sense. Paine's a really interesting character, not a member of Congress, not even an American very long. He'd been here barely a year, born and raised in England, a failure at pretty much everything he tried in life. Failure in business, failure in marriage, but he had befriended Benjamin Franklin when Franklin was posted over in England. So when Paine came to Philadelphia, he looked Franklin up, and Franklin helped him get a job at a local magazine. And Paine started to write on the side. And Thomas Paine's real superpower was that he could write in ways that the common man could understand. Most writing back then was done by lawyers like John Adams, and it went over a lot of people's heads. But Paine could write for the cobblers and the blacksmiths and the farmers. And one of the most common sense things he said in Common Sense was, an island can't rule a continent. Look at them, look at us. An island can't rule a continent. What are we doing? And he also went after King George III in very personal terms, in ways that the Continental Congressmen couldn't because they had to show some political decorum. So his comments electrified the countryside. Paine would have been great on social media. People loved what he wrote, sold tens of thousands of copies, maybe 100,000 copies, and there weren't that many people in America back then. So really impressive sales, we'd all take those. But it really lit a spark. Things percolate late winter, early spring. My next date is May 15th, the 15th of May. What happened then? And a couple of things. Congress in early May had passed a resolution without much fanfare that each colony to make sure that its colonial government is in order, probably even have a colonial constitution. Passed easily on Friday, May 10th, but they thought they needed a preamble to give it context. So that weekend they assigned a 3-man committee led by John Adams to write that preamble. And this is when Adams really took charge. He wrote a fiery preamble that was 3 times as long as the resolution it introduced. And this was some of the language. It is necessary that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed, and all the powers of government exerted under the authority of the people of the colonies. Radical stuff. Adams would always say this was the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. That same day, several hundred miles to the south in Virginia, the Virginia Colonial Convention was meeting, among the most radical along with Massachusetts. And that day they decided it's time to instruct their delegates in Philadelphia to propose independence on behalf of the colonies. They write up a resolution, send it off. It takes a while to get there. It takes a while for word to spread, even among the Congress. But when Adams looked back a week later and he saw the dates, 15th of May, he wrote to a colleague in Virginia and said, "Isn't it remarkable? There are 2 assemblies came to the same conclusion on the same day." He thought it was divine intervention. Yeah, it takes a while for this resolution just to get to Philadelphia. And then the Virginia delegation had to think, what do we do with this? This is not your normal resolution. You're proposing to break away from the greatest power in the world. They deliberated for a few days. It chose June 7th, the 7th of June, when Richard Henry Lee of the Virginia delegation would propose independence to Congress. He was part of the famed aristocratic Lee family of Virginia, been there since the 1600s. One of his ancestors was Light Horse Harry Lee, riding with General Washington. One of the descendants in his family tree would be Robert E. Lee. You may have heard of him. January 7th, he proposes that these United Colonies, June 7th, that these United Colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states. It's a little bit of an odd way to say it, isn't it? Are, and of right ought to be. But Lee didn't just pick that phrase out of thin air. He knew that Parliament had used that phrase in a document in the 1760s to criticize the colonists, and it stuck in his craw, and he wanted to throw it back in their face. He knew most people would remember, and certainly nobody in modern education knows it, but he knew that King and Parliament would get it, and he was quite proud of himself. So he proposes independence. Golly gee, we have to start debating. So June 7th, June 8th, they start the debate. They realized very quickly they weren't anywhere close to a consensus. Jefferson wrote that if the vote had been taken in mid-June, independence might have squeaked by a 7-6 margin. There were still 6 colonies in mid-June either were against independence or the delegations in Philadelphia did not have permission from the assemblies back home to vote for something that radical. They could not act independently. They were appointed. They were given instructions from the assemblies back home. And they'd been in Philadelphia for a while. Things had changed in the countryside. They didn't know what to do. They said, let's call a halt in the debate. Let's delay it for 3 weeks till July 1st. In the meantime, we'll send back to our local assemblies and see if we can get some clarity of instructions. But while this is going on, while this delay is going to happen, maybe we should come up with a document. Because when we declare independence, if the vote goes that way, we're going to need a propaganda piece to explain it to everyone. We form a committee that can write it, and if we declare independence, we'll have it. If not, we'll rip it up. No one will ever know that it happened. They form a 5-man committee, geographically diverse. John Adams, Massachusetts, he's everywhere. Roger Sherman, Connecticut, 2 New England guys. Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania and Robert R. Livingston of New York, 2 Middle Staters. Livingston actually was against independence, and somehow he gets on the committee. And a young lawyer from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. So the question that stands out is, why isn't Richard Henry Lee Virginia's representative on this committee? He's the Virginia firebrand. He leads the delegation. He proposed independence, for heaven's sake. Well, back then and all the way up into the Civil War, what happened back in your colony, in your state, was most important. That was home. Your home was your country. This idea of 13 colonies amalgamated under a central government, that was so new. Virginia was writing its colonial constitution. They wanted the Great League back home to help them do that. His fellow patriot George Mason wrote a letter saying, we need you back here, brother. You got to come home. Lee also knew his wife was ill. He hadn't seen her for a while. He was worried. So he proposes independence on the 7th of June, and a few days later, he leaves and goes home to Virginia. We needed a Virginia representative on the committee. Jefferson was a good writer. He had just gotten back to Congress. He wasn't on a lot of committees. He didn't have a lot to do. Here, Thomas, you write it. I really think, folks, I've never seen this written anywhere, that if Richard Henry Lee had stayed, Richard Henry Lee would have been Virginia's representative on that committee. And either Lee or John Adams would have written the Declaration of Independence. It would have read differently. And who knows what the arc of Jefferson's career would have been at that point. The committee gets together, and we often ask, how long did it take Jefferson to write his original draft? They met for the first time on June 11th. They turned it in June 28th. So you're often reading it, 17 days, a pretty weighty document. It might have taken that long. But Adams, writing years later, says he remembers Jefferson completing it in 2 or 3 days. And I think Adams is right. When he started writing, June 11th was a Tuesday. There is evidence that Adams had a document to start editing on Friday or Saturday. Not only that, but that Friday, June 14th, Jefferson got another assignment from Congress. He had to write not 1, but 2 documents on the war up in Canada. They were due Monday morning. He'd spend the whole weekend writing those documents. So I think he did this very quickly. And then the committee would pass it around and start some of their editing. They did some really good work including on the most famous passage today. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is beautiful language. It sings. Do you know how that read when Jefferson first turned it into the committee? We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, and from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A little clunkier, a little more wordy. The committee did a pretty good job here. They made Jefferson's writing better. Next one. This is one of the most famous paintings in American history. It hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. If you've ever done a tour down there, you would have seen it. It's titled Declaration of Independence, and many people think it is a romanticized version of the Continental Congressman lining up to sign the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. It is not that. This is June 28th, the 28th of June, when Jefferson and the committee up front, Jefferson the tall guy, are presenting their draft to John Hancock, the President of Congress. That's what it depicts. Why they chose that, I don't know, but that's what that depicts. So it's not July 4th, it's June 28th. The 28th of June is another very important day in the independence process. Now, 28th of June is a Friday. Congress had been working long hours. They didn't have many days off, a lot of pressure, the war's going on. The big debate is coming Monday, July 1st. They decide to finally take the weekend off. They gave themselves 2 days off. There is a chance over the weekend that a couple of them may have seen this draft, but most would not have seen the draft before the debate started and resumed on Monday, July 1st. John Adams, he knew it was such an important day. He was walking a few blocks to what they then called the State House, what's now Independence Hall. He thought to himself, this may be the most important debate that ever takes place in America. They debate for 9 hours that day. The lead combatants were John Adams for the Radicals, who wanted independence, and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania for the moderates, who were saying, maybe we're going a little too fast. There were others certainly who spoke in 9 hours, but they were the leaders. Congress also a bit of a haphazard organization back then. New delegates were always showing up. That afternoon, that very afternoon, new delegates from New Jersey reported to Congress. And they showed up after Adams had completed his speech. They said, Mr. Adams, will you give your speech again? Adams blew his stack. I'm not an actor, I'm not a gladiator, I can't do this on cue. And then one of his calmer colleagues comes over, puts his arm around him and says, John, you know this better than anyone. We need their votes. You have to do this again. So Adams does. They go so long, they're exhausted, they're not going to take a vote that night, but they decided to take a straw poll, the night of July 1st, 1776, like a jury would do to see where they were. On July 1st, 1776, there were still 4 colonies that weren't ready to vote for independence. There were 9 colonies for, 2 against, South Carolina and Pennsylvania. 1 colony was deadlocked, that was Delaware. They all had different sizes of delegations, people going in and out. Delaware had 2 guys there. 1 for, 1 against, their time. New York still didn't have permission from its assembly back home to vote, so they're abstaining, so it's 9-2-1-1. Independence would have passed by a very comfortable margin, but they knew that wasn't good enough, that the British would have exploited any lack of unanimity. They had to get to a unanimous vote. They did what they always did in times of crisis. They repaired that night to their favorite tavern, the city tavern a few blocks away, where they would drink and argue and make decisions. A momentous night in American history. I wish I could tell you what was said, but not one of them ever wrote down what was said that night. I don't know if they didn't think it was important or so many other things were going on. We don't know. But something important was said, because the next morning, July 2nd, things had changed. South Carolina had changed its mind. It's in the yes column for independence. Pennsylvania had changed its mind only because 2 of the naysayers decided they wouldn't show up that day. John Dickinson and Robert Morris did not think they could vote for independence, but they saw the way the wind was blowing. They didn't want to stand in the way. So Pennsylvania's internal vote on the night of July 1st was 5-4 against independence. Its internal vote on the morning of July 2nd was 4-3 for independence. Pennsylvania's in the yes column. Delaware's not that far away. They sent home a man named Caesar Rodney, rides 80 miles through the night. Showed up the morning of July 2nd, said to have mud still splattered on his boots to break Delaware's tie for independence. New York is still abstaining, but that didn't matter. It wasn't a negative vote. They could deal with that. 12 votes for, not against, 1 abstention. The resolution passes. Do they make a big announcement? No. Do they issue a press release? No. Thankfully, someone, we don't know who, leaks word of this to a Philadelphia newspaper. And that evening, July 2nd, the Philadelphia Evening Post, the Pennsylvania Evening Post, squeezes 1 sentence without a headline into its 4th and final page under a letter that someone has written and over an ad for selling boats. And it says, "This day the Continental Congress declared the United Colonies free and independent states. Breaking news." Then if a senator gets a hangnail, it's breaking news on CNN. This is the way they really announced independence, but you only knew it if you were in Philadelphia and you bought the Pennsylvania Evening Post. But John Adams knew that something really important had happened. And the next day, July 3rd, he writes a letter to his wife Abigail back in Massachusetts, and he writes, "The second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore." Adams in 1776 got the celebration exactly right. He just had the wrong day. We'll talk a little bit about why it's remembered differently in history. Now, Congress still has some work to do. July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, they undergo a massive group editing effort of the document. Group editing is really painful, but they did a pretty good job. Historians generally agree they made the document better. Everyone agreed but Thomas Jefferson. They're doing this in his presence. He's squirming all 3 days. Franklin at one point felt so bad for him, goes over, puts his arm around him, tells him a couple of anecdotes to try to make him laugh. Jefferson never got over it. He would spend weeks and months taking the time to write out his original version and the final version and sending it to his friends and saying, here both of them, which one's better? Which one do you think is better? They say, oh, Thomas, yours is better. They mangled your work. But historians generally agree that they did a pretty good job. Now that night, July 4th, they decided they need to get this thing printed. So they locate a Philadelphia printer, a guy named John Dunlap, and there were 200 one-page copies, one-page broadsides, the Dunlap broadsides. He works on it through the night of July 4th, finishes it the morning of July 5th. We'll go to the next one. This is the first one that I showed you. So this is the version that's delivered to President Hancock. This is the version that he will send to all the 13 colonial assemblies. He'll send it to General Washington in New York to read to the troops. He'll send it to our representatives over in England, so they have it. New York gets it. And this is the version that would be printed in local newspapers throughout the colonies over the next month and read in public readings in town squares. A lot of people heard about this through public readings in town squares. And what is the first line that people read or heard? In Congress, July 4th, 1776. That's why July 4th is our Independence Day. It comes down to that. It's what everybody heard. That became their reality. That's Independence Day. It is published in a newspaper for the first time in its entirety on July 6th in the Pennsylvania Evening Post. They get the scoop again. And it's read in public for the first time in Philadelphia on July 8th in a big ceremony behind the State House, what we now call Independence Hall, the courtyard behind Independence Hall. Next photo. The National Park Service holds a reenactment of this event every year on July 8th. They dress up. They don't have the modern speaker, obviously, but they're people, they're patriots and loyalists in the audience yelling things. And my wife Colleen and I went to this one this past July 8th. We went to see it. Pretty interesting event. Probably about 300 people there, but about halfway through, I said to Colleen, I think we're the only ones that came here specifically for this date. I think these other people just happened to show up today and they got a pretty good show. They didn't know that it was going to happen. But it happens every year on July 8th. Now this played out throughout the colonies, throughout the month of July, and even into early August. There would be printings in newspapers and public readings. Boston had a big public reading on July 18th, Baltimore, end of the month. The Declaration doesn't even get to South Carolina or Georgia until early August. Good people of Georgia were so excited they held a mock funeral for King George III. The word is spreading. But a lot is going on at the same time. For the purpose of my book and this talk, we'll go back in history just a bit to July 9th, the 9th of July. What happened that day? That is when the New York Provincial Assembly meets for the first time in a week. They had to flee a little bit because the war was getting close, a lot of pressure on these guys. Now they're meeting for the first time in a week, and it's like, guys, we're behind the times here. Everybody else is voting for independence. What are we going to do? A lot of loyalists in New York, but they grudgingly decided they better get with the program, and they approved a resolution where their delegates in Philadelphia can vote for independence. They write that up on July 9th, send it to Philadelphia. It gets there about July 15th, and Congress is excited. They go through the procedure. They have New York vote, and now it's a 13-0 vote. And someone says, wait, we need a new document. We need a document that says this has been a unanimous vote. And maybe it should be handwritten, and maybe we should leave a space so we can sign it. So they decide to do that. The assignment goes to a man named Timothy Matlack, not in Congress. He was an aide to one of the secretaries of Congress. His name is not famous in history, but it is mentioned in the Nicolas Cage movie. So that's his long claim to fame. If you don't ever watch that again, you hear the name Matlack. It takes a long time. He doesn't do this overnight. But on August 2nd, he turns it in. That's the time he turns that document into Congress. Next one. There it is. There's space at the bottom. And on August 2nd, the 2nd of August, was the first time anybody signed this document. Nobody signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. Nobody signed it in the month of July. This document didn't even exist then. They didn't even see it until August. They start to sign it. Eventually, there will be 56 signatures. Historians believe 47 men signed on this day, August 2nd. Congress never kept attendance, but through letters and other documents, you can tell who was in Philadelphia. I think 47 guys were there. The other 9 would sign throughout the fall and winter, mostly. There were some quirky stories. Some of the guys who signed late, they hadn't even been appointed to Congress by July 4th. They were appointed later. They wanted to be on a document. One guy who voted for it didn't sign. One guy who voted against it did sign. Thomas McMillan of Delaware, one of the leaders in the argument for independence, voted for independence and left almost immediately to fight in the Revolutionary War. So he didn't sign until 1777. Key point here is this document was not made public immediately. No one knew in August of 1776 who signed the Declaration. Why? The war wasn't going that well. A little treason thing. We didn't want to publicize our names just yet. It's not until the end of the year, the 25th of December, Washington crosses at Delaware, we get a few victories in New Jersey. Congress feels emboldened early in 1777. They have fled as well. The British were close to Philadelphia. They fled, were meeting in Baltimore, and they want yet another printed version. They contract with a with a Baltimore printer, a female printer, of which there weren't many in 1777. Mary Catherine Goddard produces the Goddard broadside. As we saw, nice and neat, and its biggest contribution in identifying the signers by states. They signed in groups on the handwritten version, but it didn't say which state. These guys, here you can see who from New Hampshire, who from Virginia, who from New York signed this document. And they did make this public. So this is the first time Americans start to see who signed the Declaration. It was quite fast, a big celebration for about a week. And then, folks, for about 10 years, the great founding document, the Declaration of Independence, was pretty much forgotten. Why? It had done its job. It declared independence. Very nice, we still have to win the war. This document means nothing if we don't win the war. So it went away, it kind of faded into history. Historic things don't become historic for a while sometimes, till we realize what has happened. It's not until 1781 that the British surrendered at Yorktown. Not until 1783 that they signed the peace treaty. That's when we really became independent. Not until 1787 that we have the Constitution. And it's not until the 1780s that anyone outside the Continental Congress realizes that Thomas Jefferson was the primary author. That was not publicized in the 1770s. As time goes on, history goes on, this thing becomes more important. And then come the 1790s, and American political partisanship takes over. And who were two of the lead combatants? John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. The twin pillars of independence became mortal political enemies over the way the country should have been run. Jefferson defeats Adams for the presidency in 1800. Adams is so upset he doesn't attend Jefferson's inauguration. They don't speak or write to one another for more than 10 years. It's not until the 1820s, really, when another generation, the War of 1812 generation, which has also fought the British, says, wait a second, what's going on these last 35 or 40 years? Two wars. How did independence happen? We don't really know. There aren't many records. A couple of guys are still alive. We got to ask them. Adams and Jefferson have buried the hatchet by then. They started to write. Believe it or not, much of what we know from the independence era comes from things that Adams and Jefferson wrote in the 1800s. A lot of it in the 1820s. They were first-person sources, obviously. They were there. They knew what happened. But they're also very old men. They've forgotten. They misremember. They differ. They debate. They still argue over that. But generally, through their writing and some records that were kept in the 70s, other letters that have since come to the fore, we can piece together a pretty good narrative about what happened and how this came about. And then, of course, the Declaration becomes truly iconic when Adams and Jefferson die on the same day, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The most ridiculous quirk of history, the quirk of fate in American history you could imagine. It becomes even more enshrined a generation later when another president, Abraham Lincoln, goes to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for Union soldiers who fell in the Battle of Gettysburg. And in that speech, the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln identifies when he thinks the country began. He says it was 77 years ago. That's 87 years. Take 1863 and subtract 87, you get 1776. He's saying it did not begin in 1775 with Lexington and Concord. It did not begin in 1781 when the British surrendered at Yorktown. It did not begin in 1783 with the Peace Treaty. It did not begin in 1787 with the Constitution. It began in 1776. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It has been enshrined and hallowed since then, often brought up at times of our greatest crisis. In my lifetime, that's Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra affair, September 11th, up to the modern day. But John Adams was one guy who thought we might mess this up. He sent a warning. He wrote it was in a private letter to his wife Abigail in 1777, just a year later. But he knew this would eventually become public. And this is what Adams wrote. Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that never took half the pains to preserve it. Think of that when you go home tonight. Thank you.